My mother left me at a remote boarding school when I was only 8 years old. She swore, hand on heart, that she would come back for me by Thanksgiving. She never came back. She never once visited. Not a single time in 10 long years. The day I graduated from high school, I stood on a creaking wooden stage and looked out over a sea of beaming parents clutching bouquets and cameras. I scanned every row for one familiar face. My chair in the audience sat empty. 13 years passed, wrapped in total silence. Then, last Tuesday, my phone finally rang. My mother was on the line, frantic and breathless, demanding $3,000 for rent, insisting she was about to be thrown out onto the street. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I asked her a single question. The moment she heard it, the line went dead silent for a full 40 seconds. Before I tell you exactly what I asked her, take a second to like and subscribe to Luke Revenge Start. But only do that if this story genuinely resonates with you. Also drop your age and where you're watching from in the comments. I read every single one of them. Now let me take you back to my office, perched above the Alaskan wilderness, the place where that 13-year silence finally broke apart. My name is Elmira Johnson. I'm 31 years old, and I live in Alaska. My office sits high on a ridge, surrounded by towering Sitka spruce, with an unbroken view of the Chugach Mountains. The air outside that afternoon was 10 below zero, crisp, sharp, and completely unforgiving. Inside, though, my sanctuary stayed warm, built from cedar and floor-to-ceiling glass. I earned every inch of that view. I built my luxury ecotourism company, Aurora Estates, from absolutely nothing. I survived on academic scholarships, waitressing shifts, and a stubborn refusal to fail. I carved a whole life out of the scraps I'd been handed. I was deep in quarterly financial projections when my personal cell phone lit up on the mahogany desk. A Seattle area code flashed across the screen. I answered out of habit, expecting a vendor or a client. Instead, a voice I hadn't heard since childhood filled the room. Elmira. Oh my God, Elmira. It was Brenda, my mother. Her tone carried no warmth, no hesitation, and absolutely no guilt for a decade of abandonment. It was sharp, breathless, and dripping with entitlement. Frank left me, she sobbed into the receiver. He took the truck. He emptied the checking account. The landlord handed me a 3-day eviction notice this morning. If I don't wire $3,000 by tomorrow, I'll be out on the street. You have to help me. No greeting. No apology. 13 years without a single word, and she opened her mouth only to make a demand. I leaned back in my leather chair and felt my heart rate slow. I held the phone to my ear and watched a bald eagle circle the tree line outside my window. As a child, the sound of her voice would have sent me spiraling into panic. I spent my entire youth terrified of earning her approval, waiting by the dorm room window, hoping her car would finally turn into the gravel driveway. Now she was just a stranger in Seattle with bad credit. "Are you even listening to me?" Brenda snapped, her tears evaporating the instant she didn't get an immediate yes. "I need you to wire the money today." I picked up my ceramic mug and took a slow sip of black coffee. "What was the name of the boarding school you left me at for 10 years?" I asked. The silence that followed was heavy, not a brief pause, but a staggering 40 seconds of dead air. I timed it against the digital clock on my desk. 10 seconds passed. I heard her breath hitch. 20 seconds. I caught the faint hum of city traffic behind her. 30 seconds. I could practically hear her mind scrambling, desperate to dredge up a single detail she'd never once bothered to learn. She had no idea. She never read a single report card. She never signed a permission slip. She only ever forwarded the tuition checks that kept me safely tucked away from her new life. She'd discarded me so she could pour herself entirely into her new husband and my younger half-sister Chloe. Brenda stammered, her voice trembling as the full weight of her failure finally landed. It was. I pressed the red button on my screen. The call died. I set the phone face down on the desk, and a profound sense of peace washed over me. The ghost that had haunted my childhood was gone, replaced by a desperate woman who'd simply run out of options. I turned back to my laptop, ready to finalize payroll for my 50 employees. The whole thing felt resolved. 10 minutes later, the phone buzzed against the wood. A text lit up the screen from her number. I read the words twice while an icy Alaskan wind suddenly howled against my office windows. "You leave me no choice. We are coming to Alaska." The plural pronoun caught my attention immediately. We? Brenda wasn't traveling alone. She was bringing her favorite daughter, Chloe, and Chloe's husband, Trent. They were already packing their bags, marching toward a place they knew nothing about, barging into a life they'd had no part in building. I set the phone down and swiveled my chair toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The sun was dipping behind the Chugach Mountains, throwing long, sharp shadows across the snow-covered pines. The bitter cold outside mirrored the chill that had lived in my chest for 23 years. That threat glowing on the screen dragged up a vivid memory of the exact day the silence began. I was 8 years old, sitting in the passenger seat of Brenda's sedan. We drove for hours down winding, icy roads until we reached a sprawling brick building isolated deep in the wilderness, a boarding school for children whose families had run out of options, or more honestly, for children whose parents simply wanted a clean slate. Brenda told me to grab my duffel bag from the trunk. She knelt in the gravel, straightened the collar of my jacket, and promised she'd be back for Thanksgiving. She told me to be a good girl and not cause the headmaster any trouble. Then she climbed back into her car, shifted into drive, and pulled away. I stood on the frozen dirt and watched her taillights vanish around the bend. I waited by that window every single day that November. Thanksgiving came and went. Then Christmas. Then my 9th birthday. The silence stretched into a full decade. I learned the rhythm of the mailroom by heart, watching other girls collect care packages, letters, and birthday cards. My cubby stayed empty year after year. I spent every holiday in the emptied-out dormitories, reading borrowed books and helping the janitorial staff sweep the halls. Brenda had cast me aside so she could funnel her time, her energy, and her money into her new husband and their new baby, Chloe. Chloe was the golden child, raised in a warm house in Seattle, handed anything she ever wanted, shielded from every harsh edge of the world. I was the secret Brenda buried in the snow. That isolation reached its peak on a Tuesday evening in late May, my high school graduation. The gymnasium smelled of floor wax and cheap floral arrangements. I sat in a row of folding chairs in a rented cap and gown, listening to the principal call out names one by one. Every time a student crossed that wooden stage, a section of the bleachers erupted in cheers. Parents raised cameras, grandmothers dabbed at tears, siblings clapped and whistled. When my name echoed through the speakers, the room fell into a silence that felt deafening. I crossed the stage, took my diploma, and searched the crowd for a familiar face, still holding on to the illogical hope that Brenda had finally remembered me. My designated chair in the second row sat empty. I didn't cry that day. I took that empty chair and forged it into armor. If I was going to be entirely alone in this world, I decided I'd make myself untouchable. I worked 3 jobs through my early 20s, saving every dollar from waiting tables at night and guiding wilderness tours during the day. I studied the tourism market, bought my first acre of remote land at auction, and built a single cabin with my own 2 hands. I leveraged that cabin to build another, and then another. Today, Aurora Estates is a premier ecotourism destination that caters to some of the wealthiest clients in the world. I own 500 acres of pristine Alaskan wilderness, a private helicopter pad, and a grand lodge that pulls in millions in revenue every year. I turned the wilderness that was supposed to be my prison into my kingdom. My phone buzzed again, dragging me back into the warmth of my office. I looked at the text once more, and the math simply didn't add up. A sharp realization cut straight through the lingering memories. Brenda had called me less than an hour earlier, frantic, insisting she faced imminent eviction and needed $3,000 just to keep a roof over her head. Yet her text now announced she was boarding a flight with Chloe and Trent that same day. Last-minute, same-day airline tickets from Seattle to Anchorage are brutally expensive. 3 one-way fares would easily run north of $3,500. A woman sobbing over a 3-day eviction notice does not have that kind of capital lying around for premium air travel. Someone else had funded this invasion. I opened my contacts and scrolled down to the only family member who'd ever once sent me a birthday card. My grandmother, Evelyn. She lived modestly in a retirement community in Spokane, surviving entirely on a fixed monthly pension. She had a soft heart and a trusting nature. 2 traits Brenda had learned to exploit again and again. I tapped her name and put the phone on speaker. It rang twice before her frail, familiar voice picked up. "Almira, sweetheart. Oh, I am just so happy to hear your voice." Her tone was bright, lit up with a sudden, fragile hope. It made my stomach twist. "Hi, Nana," I said, keeping my voice steady and warm. "How are you doing today?" "I am just overjoyed, honey. Brenda called me a few hours ago. She told me the most wonderful news. I've been crying happy tears all afternoon." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany desk. "What news did she share with you, Nana?" Evelyn let out a soft, relieved sigh. "She said you called her. She said you were weeping, begging her to forgive the past, asking her to finally come visit so the 2 of you could heal the family. She said you wanted to reconcile with her and Chloe, but couldn't afford to fly them all the way up to Alaska." The sheer size of the lie hung in the air. Brenda hadn't just bent the truth. She had invented an entire emotional fantasy in order to manipulate an 80-year-old woman. "Is that right?" I murmured, staring at the grain of the wood on my desk. "Yes, dear. She said it was an emergency, that you needed your mother right now. I know my pension is tight, but family is family." I went down to the bank and wired her $3,500 so she could buy the tickets for herself, Chloe, and Trent. "I am just so proud of you for taking the first step to fix things, Almira." A cold fury settled deep into my bones. Brenda hadn't only abandoned me as a child, she had weaponized my own trauma, inventing tears I never shed, just to rob her own mother blind. She'd drained an elderly woman's savings to bankroll a parasitic vacation, all dressed up as a story about maternal healing. I didn't correct Evelyn. I couldn't bring myself to break her heart, or humiliate her by revealing that her own daughter had conned her out of her living expenses. I would deal with Brenda myself, and I would make absolutely sure Evelyn's money came back. With interest. "Thank you, Nana," I said softly. "I love you. I'll talk to you soon." "I love you too, sweetheart. Have a beautiful reunion." I ended the call, and the very last trace of biological obligation drained out of my conscience. These weren't people seeking connection. They were a financial cartel hunting for a new mark. I turned to my computer and opened a flight tracking site, typed in the origin and destination, and watched a digital map fill the screen. A tiny white airplane crawling steadily across the Gulf of Alaska. Flight 492. Currently cruising at 36,000 feet, carrying 3 passengers convinced they'd outsmarted everyone. They expected to land in Anchorage and find the same broken, desperate girl they'd thrown away 23 years earlier. They expected a soft target, some woman scraping by paycheck to paycheck in a frozen, desolate shack, ripe for the taking. They intended to barge into my life, assert their dominance, and leech off everything I'd built. I watched the altitude numbers on the screen tick steadily downward. The plane had started its descent. I stood, walked to the coat rack, and pulled down my heaviest winter parka. If they wanted to play a game of deception, then I would set the board myself. I wouldn't block them at the airport. I wouldn't flaunt my wealth or my security team. I would give them exactly what they expected to find. I would feed their arrogance, let them settle comfortably into their entitlement, and give them just enough rope to tie their own knot. I grabbed my keys, walked out of my luxury office, and headed toward the employee parking lot. I had a flight of my own to catch. The arrivals curb at Anchorage International Airport is a chaotic stretch of concrete. I parked in the loading zone and left the engine running, not in my usual Range Rover, but in a battered 2010 Subaru Outback, the same vehicle that doubled as a snowplow and utility hauler for my ground maintenance crew. The paint was chipped. The rear bumper carried a deep dent from a misjudged snowbank, and the interior smelled faintly of wet pine needles and industrial floor cleaner. It was the perfect prop for the stage I'd built. I stood by the front fender, letting the biting wind whip my hair across my face. I wore a faded flannel shirt and a scuffed, aging, insulated jacket. The sliding glass doors parted, and 3 figures stepped out into the freezing Alaskan evening. Brenda led the group, wrapped in a pristine white faux fur coat, looking like a woman expecting a red carpet instead of a frozen tundra. Behind her came Chloe, my younger half-sister, dragging a designer suitcase with a broken wheel, her face pinched in discomfort. She wore thin leather boots, hopelessly unsuited for the ice underfoot. Beside her stood Trent, her husband, in a fitted designer tracksuit, cradling a premium coffee cup and making zero effort to help his wife with her struggling luggage. Brenda spotted me. Her eyes swept over my faded jacket, flicked toward the rusted wheel wells of the Subaru, and settled into a look of profound pity. That single expression told me everything. She believed she'd flown straight into a rescue mission where she'd hold every card. She walked toward me, arms outstretched, and wrapped me in a stiff, perfumed embrace. "Almira," she sighed, stepping back to inspect my face. "You look so tired, sweetheart. And this cold? How do you even live in this misery?" "It builds character," I replied smoothly, keeping my tone soft and submissive. "Let me help with your bags." Chloe shoved her suitcase toward me without a single word of greeting. "Watch the zippers. They cost more than that car," she muttered, tightening her scarf. "Is the heater even working in that junk heap?" "It takes a few minutes to warm up," I said, hauling the heavy luggage into the trunk beside a pair of muddy jumper cables. "I'm sorry it's not fancier. Money's been tight lately." Brenda traded a knowing glance with Chloe, a look of smug validation. They wanted me to be destitute. My poverty justified Brenda's abandonment. If I was a failure, then leaving me behind was just a tragic circumstance, not a moral one. Trent finally spoke, gesturing at the back seat with his coffee cup. "You expect all of us to fit back there? I've got bad knees. I need legroom." "It's only a 2-hour drive," I offered meekly, closing the trunk. "I'll drive carefully." The drive out of Anchorage and into the deep wilderness gave them plenty of room to reveal exactly who they were. The heater in the Subaru rattled loudly, coughing out lukewarm air. Chloe complained non-stop from the back seat about the lack of cell service, the rough suspension, and the smell of the upholstery. Brenda sat in the passenger seat, dishing out thinly veiled insults disguised as motherly advice. "You know, Almira," Brenda said, adjusting her designer sunglasses despite the setting sun. "Seattle has so many opportunities. You don't have to struggle out here in the middle of nowhere. I'm sure Trent could find you some entry-level position at his firm. You could answer phones. It's honest work." Trent snorted from the back. "She'd need to update her wardrobe first. No offense, Almira, but you look like a lumberjack." "None taken," I replied softly, my hands steady on the wheel. I filed away every word, every insult, every arrogant assumption. I let them keep building their false little reality. Chloe kicked the back of my seat. We need to stop for groceries. I'm starving. I only eat organic, and Trent needs his specific protein shakes. You're paying, right? Since you dragged us all the way up here for this reunion. I've got some basics waiting for you, I said, sidestepping the demand. I stretched my budget to get you some nice things. Chloe scoffed. Basics? Great. I hope you at least have decent Wi-Fi. We turned off the main highway onto a secluded, unpaved logging road. The Subaru bounced over deep ruts and snowdrifts. After 10 minutes threading through dense spruce, we finally arrived. It was a small, rustic staff cabin, tucked on the outermost edge of the property, stripped of every luxury my family had expected. I parked and killed the engine. The silence of the forest closed in around us. We're here, I announced. Brenda stared through the windshield, her jaw dropping slightly. Here? You live here? It's modest, I said, opening my door, but it keeps the wind out. Trent stepped into the snow, looking around in open disgust. There's no paved driveway. Where's the nearest store? How do we order food? There's no delivery out here, I explained, carrying their bags onto the porch. You'll have to cook your own meals. The stove's wood-burning, but I left you plenty of kindling. Chloe stood frozen near the bumper, refusing to step into the snow. A wood-burning stove? Are you kidding me? What kind of savage lifestyle is this? I need room service. I need a hot shower. You expect me to chop wood? I'm sorry, I said, lowering my gaze to the floorboards. I truly am. This is the best I can offer right now. I thought you wanted to see my life. I thought you wanted to be a family. Brenda stepped onto the porch, waving a dismissive hand. We do, sweetheart. But we're accustomed to a certain standard of living. It's just quite a shock to see how far you've fallen. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and pushed it open. The interior was clean but strictly basic. A small kitchenette, a single bathroom with a temperamental water heater, and a lofted sleeping area. No television, no internet router. Just the quiet isolation of the Alaskan woods. Settle in, I told them, leaving the keys on a small wooden table. I have to head back to work for a few hours. I'll check on you tomorrow. Chloe crossed her arms, shivering in the middle of the room. You're leaving us here? In this shack? What are we supposed to do for entertainment? There are some board games in the cupboard, I suggested softly, and slipped out before they could invent another demand. I walked down the steps and climbed back into the rusted Subaru, started the engine, and shifted into drive. In the rearview mirror, Brenda stood staring out the cabin window, her face twisted into a mix of horror and profound disappointment. They believed they'd won. They believed they'd just established total dominance over some weak, impoverished relative. They had no idea they were standing on a tiny, isolated sliver of my actual kingdom. I drove back down the unpaved logging road until the staff cabin vanished behind the tree line. Once I reached the private security gate, I pressed a button on my sun visor. The heavy iron bars swung open, granting me access to the restricted inner grounds of Aurora Estates. The rough dirt path gave way to smooth, heated asphalt that melted the falling snow on contact. I drove just past the high ridge, leaving the illusion of poverty far behind me. The landscape opened onto my actual residence, a breathtaking $4 million architectural masterpiece built from imported timber and floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass. Warm golden light spilled from the expansive living room out across the pristine snow. A private heated driveway curved toward a 4-car garage where my real vehicles waited. I parked the old Subaru near the maintenance shed and walked up the illuminated stone pathway to my front door. The biometric scanner read my fingerprint and unlocked the custom oak entrance. I stepped inside. The air was perfectly climate-controlled, the faint scent of cedar and expensive vanilla filling the grand foyer. I hung my faded jacket in the closet, shedding the character of the struggling sister along with it. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the marble kitchen island and walked to my expansive living room windows, looking out over the dark expanse of my property. Somewhere out there in the freezing woods, my mother and her golden family were huddled around a cold stove, plotting how best to exploit a woman who no longer existed. I took a slow, deliberate sip from my glass. The trap was set. Now I just needed to let them spring it. The radiant floor heating of my master bathroom hummed quietly beneath my feet. I stood before the seamless glass mirror, brushing my hair, watching the Chugach Mountains shift through shades of indigo and pale gold. My whole environment was a fortress of comfort. 2 miles away, inside a poorly insulated wooden box, my guests were likely shivering under thin wool blankets. I felt no pity. Pity is reserved for victims of circumstance. They were the architects of their own discomfort. I walked into my home office and opened a heavy mahogany drawer, pulling out a standard-issue black leather portfolio. I filled it with mundane operational paperwork, routine maintenance schedules for the resort generators, vendor supply lists for the dining room, snow removal logs. It was exactly the kind of portfolio a mid-level property manager might carry. Into the front interior pocket, I slid a silver corporate credit card bearing my name and the Aurora Estates logo, its limit high enough to buy a luxury vehicle outright. Next, I picked up a small digital voice recorder, disguised to look like a standard USB flash drive, activated its sound detection setting, and tucked it into my coat pocket. I drove the rusted Subaru back down the logging road. The forest sat silent, thick with fresh powder. I parked near the staff cabin and climbed the creaking steps, carrying a single paper bag of discount groceries. I pushed the door open. The interior was frigid. The wood stove had burned out hours earlier. Brenda was huddled on the small sofa, wearing her faux fur coat over her pajamas. Chloe and Trent were tangled in sleeping bags up in the loft, grumbling about the draft. "Good morning," I said, setting the paper bag on the kitchen counter. Beside it, I casually placed the small black USB drive, letting it blend in with a pile of spare batteries and matches. I dropped the leather portfolio onto the small wooden dining table. I brought instant coffee and bread. I have to rush to my shift at the resort. The roads need plowing. Brenda glared at me, her lips pale from the cold. "You let the fire die." "I was asleep," I replied evenly. "The extra firewood's on the porch. Have a good day." I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out, letting the heavy door click shut behind me. I drove straight to the main security hub hidden beneath the Aurora Estates luxury lodge. The room hummed with server racks and glowed with dozens of high-definition monitors. I dismissed the overnight guard and settled into the chair at the primary console. I typed in a secure command, and the screen in front of me split into 4 separate camera angles, offering a crystal-clear view of the staff cabin's interior. I watched my family drag themselves out of bed. Trent rubbed his hands together, cursing the temperature. He refused to step outside for firewood, opting instead to flip on the weak electric space heater. Chloe climbed down the loft ladder, hair a mess, expression sour. She walked to the grocery bag, peeked inside, and threw her hands up in disgust. She had wanted artisanal pastries and fresh fruit. I'd given them generic white bread and instant powder. Watching Chloe pout sparked a sharp realization about our 2 contrasting realities. We shared the same mother, yet somehow inhabited entirely different planets. When Chloe turned 16, Brenda bought her a brand new European convertible wrapped in a giant red bow. When I turned 16, I was scrubbing industrial pots in the boarding school cafeteria just to earn extra meal tokens. At 18, Brenda paid for Chloe's full tuition at an expensive private university in California. Chloe lasted exactly 3 semesters before dropping out. She simply despised waking up for morning lectures. She moved back home and met Trent, a man whose highest aspiration in life was standing in line for limited edition sneakers. Brenda financed their lavish wedding, drained her own savings to cover their rent, and treated them like royalty. Chloe never faced a single consequence in her life. She'd been conditioned, from the very beginning, to believe the universe owed her a frictionless existence. On the monitor, Chloe's boredom quickly curdled into something closer to systematic intrusion. Convinced I was miles away pushing snow, she began tearing through the tiny cabin, opening every drawer, rummaging through the little closet, inspecting the bathroom cabinets. She was hunting for cash, expensive liquor, or anything of value she could pawn or consume. She found nothing but spare towels and canned soup. Frustrated, her eyes finally landed on the black leather portfolio sitting on the dining table. She grabbed it, unzipped the leather binding, and began flipping through the pages. I zoomed the camera in on her face and watched her lips move as she skimmed the maintenance schedules and vendor contracts. A smirk crept across her features. "She's just a glorified janitor," Chloe announced to the room, tossing a page onto the table. "Look at this. She doesn't even own anything. She's just a property manager for that big resort up the road. She coordinates snowplows and orders toilet paper." Trent walked over, leaning across her shoulder to look. Brenda watched from the sofa, shaking her head in profound disappointment. They felt vindicated. My supposed lowly status soothed their bruised egos. Then Chloe's fingers found the interior pocket. She pulled out the silver corporate card, and the whole atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly. The complaining stopped. Chloe stared at the embossed numbers, tracing the Aurora Estates logo with her thumb. That card represented everything she felt she was owed. "What is that?" Trent asked, his eyes widening. "It's an expense card," Chloe said, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "It has her name on it, but it belongs to the resort. It's corporate money." "Put that back, Chloe," Brenda said weakly from the couch, a performative objection, entirely lacking real authority or moral conviction. She was play-acting the responsible parent while secretly hoping her daughter would land the prize. "Are you kidding?" Chloe scoffed, sliding the silver card into the back pocket of her designer jeans. "She dragged us to this frozen hellhole. She made us sleep on lumpy mattresses and eat instant oatmeal. She owes us for being such a terrible sister. Besides, the resort pays the bill. Corporate entities write this stuff off all the time. They won't even notice." Trent grinned, clapping his hands together. "We deserve a real vacation. Let's get out of this shack." Chloe rationalized grand theft in under 30 seconds. She didn't view it as a crime. She viewed it as a belated inheritance. She felt entitled to compensation for the mere inconvenience of existing in a space that didn't cater to her luxury standards. I sat in the glow of the security monitors. My heart rate didn't rise. My hand stayed steady on the console keyboard. I watched my half-sister steal my financial property without a shred of hesitation. The trap was no longer just set. The prey had stepped directly onto the pressure plate. The video feed offered undeniable proof of the theft. But I needed more. Visuals capture the action, audio captures the intent. I zoomed the camera out, focusing on the kitchen counter. The black USB device sat exactly where I'd left it, hidden in plain sight beside the bread. The voice-activated recorder spun quietly, capturing every whisper, every justification, every plot they formulated while they believed themselves alone. I leaned back in my chair and took a sip of coffee. The game was escalating, and they were playing their hand perfectly. I returned to my primary residence just as twilight faded into total darkness. The Alaskan winter sky above my estate stretched vast and starless, hinting at an approaching blizzard. The interior of my home offered a sanctuary of quiet warmth, a stark contrast to the bitter chill outside. The stone fireplace crackled, casting a soft orange glow across the vaulted timber ceiling and polished slate floors. I walked into the kitchen, poured a single glass of dark red wine, and carried the crystal stemware into my private study. The drive back from the security hub had been uneventful. I'd retrieved the digital recorder from the staff cabin during a brief afternoon stop, while my uninvited guests were out exploring the resort boundaries. Now the small black USB device rested in the palm of my hand. I plugged it into my laptop. The audio files loaded onto the high-definition screen, neatly sorted by the device's sound activation software. I took a slow sip of wine and clicked play on the longest file. The playback opened with the harsh scrape of a heavy wooden chair dragging across the rustic floorboards. Trent spoke first, his voice carrying a smug, self-satisfied edge as he paced the small kitchen, outlining a strategy to the women. He explained that the state had specific tenant laws they could exploit for financial gain. He walked them through the concept of adverse possession and squatter privileges with practiced, rehearsed ease. Trent had a strange kind of expertise in this exact subject. Back in Washington state, he'd spent 3 full years dodging eviction by weaponizing bureaucratic loopholes against independent property owners, signing a residential lease, paying the initial deposit just to get the keys, then dragging the landlord through endless administrative hearings while living rent-free the entire time. He knew exactly how to manipulate the American housing system to paralyze legal owners. Now he planned to apply that same parasitic playbook to my property. "She can't kick us out if we establish a formal residency," Trent said through the computer speakers. "The weather out here is freezing. No judge in this jurisdiction is going to authorize a winter eviction without a long legal fight. We just stay put. She'll have to bring us food, water, and firewood just to keep us quiet. We live for free until the spring thaw, and there's nothing she can do about it." Brenda didn't object to this criminal scheme. She murmured her agreement from the sofa, justifying the theft of my property by suggesting I owed them a comfortable place to stay after ignoring my family duties for so long. She validated his plan, proving her maternal instincts only ever extended to people who served her own comfort and financial stability. Chloe chimed in next. The clink of a glass sounded in the background. Her focus stayed locked on the silver expense card tucked safely in her pocket. She laid out her plans for the coming days, marching down to the main lodge to demand premium treatments at the wellness center. "I'm going to book the hot stone massage, schedule the private helicopter tour over the glaciers, and order the most expensive champagne they keep in the cellar," Chloe bragged to her audience. "I'll charge every single dollar to this corporate account. Almira's just a low-level employee. Headquarters accounting will assume it's a legitimate operational expense. Site maintenance, client entertainment, whatever. If they audit the books and find out the truth, they'll fire her, not us. They can't make her pay the balance back if she's broke. She takes the fall, and we get the luxury vacation we deserve." Listening to Chloe articulate her own fraud out loud felt deeply revealing. Growing up, Brenda shielded my half-sister from every negative consequence life ever tried to hand her. When Chloe wrecked a leased sedan at 19 driving drunk, Brenda took out a second mortgage to cover the damages rather than let the police get involved. That endless coddling had bred a predator. Chloe didn't merely want a free trip to the mountains. She wanted to extract luxury at my expense and leave me to face professional ruin. She was perfectly willing to let me take felony wire fraud charges just so she could sip vintage wine in a heated pool. I paused the recording. The silence in my study felt profound, almost clarifying. A lesser person might have wept at the betrayal. A more reactive person might have driven down the logging road, kicked the front door open, and launched into a bitter screaming match. I felt none of those predictable impulses. Confrontation requires emotional investment, and I had exactly 0 emotional investment left in the 3 strangers plotting my downfall. Their audacity had extinguished whatever ghost of familial obligation still lingered in me. They didn't see my imagined poverty as a tragic circumstance. They saw it as an opportunity for a hostile takeover. I closed the media player and opened my encrypted email client. I drafted a brief, urgent message to Marcus, the lead attorney for Aurora Estates, a brilliant, pragmatic legal mind who specialized in commercial real estate and corporate liability law. I requested an immediate virtual consultation to discuss a pressing security concern on the property. 10 minutes later, Marcus appeared on screen, sitting in his downtown Anchorage office, adjusting his glasses. I explained the situation with clinical detachment. The unauthorized occupation of the staff structure, the calculated theft of the business credit card. I instructed him not to alert the local authorities just yet. I wanted an inescapable legal enclosure built first. I need a specific contract drafted tonight, I told him, looking straight into the camera lens. A document that legally reclassifies them from family guests into transient commercial lodgers. Marcus understood the assignment instantly. Under current state regulations, standard residential tenant protections simply don't apply to people occupying commercial hospitality structures under a short-term vacation rental agreement. If they signed a document acknowledging their status as commercial guests, Trent's dream of claiming squatter privileges would evaporate on the spot. He'd have zero legal standing to fight an eviction in civil court. We spent the next hour drafting paperwork airtight enough to hold. We titled the document a Mandatory Guest Liability and Wildlife Hazard Waiver. It looked exactly like a routine administrative form required by the local municipality for anyone staying near the protected wilderness preserve. The language leaned heavily on bear safety, severe weather protocols, and emergency evacuation routes, deliberately dull enough to bore and distract any reader. Buried deep within the dense legal formatting sat a binding classification clause. It stated, in plain terms, that the occupants held zero tenancy rights, agreed to a maximum 7-day stay, and accepted a $500 daily fine for trespassing once the property owner's invitation was revoked. It further stipulated that any fraudulent activity committed on the premises would result in immediate termination of the lodging agreement, without prior notice. The trap was engineered to perfection. Marcus emailed me the final secure file. I printed the pages on thick corporate letterhead using my office laser printer, the heavy paper lending the agreement an air of undeniable bureaucratic authenticity. I clipped the document to a sleek aluminum clipboard and attached a black ink pen. They thought they were outsmarting a defeated, uneducated property manager. They believed they held all the leverage, free to dictate the terms of their survival on my land. In reality, they were about to sign away their only legal defense directly to the chief executive officer. I set the clipboard on my desk and switched off the lights in my study. Tomorrow, I would deliver their eviction notice disguised as a simple safety protocol. Morning broke late over the Chugach Mountains, filtering weakly through heavy snowfall. I stood in my kitchen savoring a cup of French press coffee while the freshly printed stack of liability waivers rested on the counter. The paper felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with its weight. It carried the burden of a meticulously crafted legal mechanism, though it looked entirely unremarkable. Just another bureaucratic form any commercial guest might encounter near protected wildlife habitat. I secured the pages to the aluminum clipboard and grabbed my keys. The drive to the staff cabin was slow, the logging road buried under fresh powder, though the rusted Subaru handled the drifts with rugged competence. As I approached the small wooden structure, I noticed a distinct lack of activity. No smoke curled from the chimney. The heavy snow on the porch sat undisturbed. They were awake, clearly, but refusing to engage with their surroundings at all. I knocked twice and pushed the heavy door open. The air inside was thick and stagnant, heated only by the inadequate electric space heater Trent had dragged into the center of the room. Brenda sat wrapped in a blanket on the small sofa, nursing a cup of the instant coffee I'd left the day before. Chloe and Trent sat at the dining table, staring blankly at the frost-covered windows, their expressions dripping with dissatisfaction. They looked like prisoners plotting an escape, with absolutely no idea I was the warden holding every key to their confinement. "Good morning," I announced, stepping onto the floorboards, my voice flat, stripped of any warmth or hospitality. Trent turned his head, his eyes landing on the clipboard in my hand. "Are you bringing us a menu? Because that instant powder is an insult." "I'm bringing administrative paperwork," I replied, pulling the pen from the clip. "Before I head to the resort for my shift, I need all three of you to sign this." Chloe rolled her eyes, arms crossed over her chest. "Sign what? We're your family, not paying customers. What is this nonsense?" I set the clipboard on the wooden table and slid it toward them. "It's a guest liability and wildlife hazard waiver. It's a mandatory requirement from the local municipality for anyone occupying commercial structures near the wilderness preserve. It covers basic protocols for bear encounters, extreme weather emergencies, and evacuation routes." Brenda sighed dramatically from the couch, tugging the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Almyra, this is ridiculous. We're staying with you. We aren't tourists." "The local government doesn't differentiate between blood relatives and tourists when it comes to property liability," I explained patiently, playing the role of the constrained, rule-following employee. "If a moose wanders onto the porch and someone gets hurt, the property owner faces steep fines if the occupants haven't signed the safety acknowledgement. I can't risk my job over missing paperwork. Please, just sign it so I can file it with the front office." Trent pulled the clipboard closer and scanned the first page, his eyes glazing over the moment he hit the dense paragraphs about seasonal bear activity and avalanche risk. He carried a profound arrogance about legal matters, convinced his past success in gaming residential tenancy law made him an expert in every civil code that existed. He never read past the first section, assuming it was exactly what I'd claimed: a boring, standard safety waiver meant to shield a faceless corporation from wildlife lawsuits. He had no idea that buried on page 3, deep in the dense formatting, sat a binding classification clause defining the signatories as transient short-term lodgers, a designation that legally annihilated any chance of claiming squatter privileges under state law. It capped their stay at 7 days and imposed a punishing $500 per day trespassing fine once the invitation was revoked. A further clause stated that any fraudulent or criminal activity on the premises would immediately void the agreement, triggering instant expulsion without notice. Trent scribbled his signature on the bottom line with a dismissive flick of the wrist. "There. You've got your bureaucratic nonsense. Now what are you going to do about the heat in this shack?" "I'll bring more firewood this evening," I promised softly, taking the clipboard back. I handed it to Chloe. She didn't even glance at the text, just grabbed the pen, scrawled her name, and shoved the clipboard back at me, her mind entirely fixed on the silver expense card hidden in her pocket. To her, the paperwork was nothing but a minor annoyance delaying her grand plan. I carried the clipboard to Brenda. She signed with a heavy, theatrical sigh, acting as though she were doing some enormous favor for a difficult child. "Thank you," I said, tucking the pen away. "I'll file these immediately. I hope you enjoy your day." I walked out of the cabin, the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind me. I stood on the snowy porch and looked down at the 3 signatures now securing my legal enclosure. They believed they'd just outsmarted a powerless property manager. They thought their arrival marked the start of a long, free ride at my expense. In reality, they'd just voluntarily surrendered every legal defense they had directly to the chief executive officer of Aurora Estates. I drove back to the main security hub and placed the signed documents into a fireproof safe. The legal snare was set. Now I needed the financial trap to snap shut too. I returned to my private office overlooking the resort grounds and spent the morning reviewing architectural plans for a new luxury spa expansion. The snow kept falling, blanketing the wilderness in pristine white. At exactly 1:15 in the afternoon, my desktop phone chirped. A direct line from the front desk of the main lodge. I picked up the receiver. "Ms. Johnson?" The voice of my lead concierge, Sarah, sounded hesitant. "I apologize for interrupting your afternoon, but we have a situation at the reception desk that requires your attention." "Go ahead, Sarah. What's the issue?" "A young woman just arrived at the lodge. She's quite demanding. She requested our premium wellness package, the 2-hour hot stone massage, the glacial mud wrap, and a private helicopter tour over the Chugach Range, all for this afternoon." I leaned back in my chair, a slow, satisfied smile forming on my lips. Chloe was executing her plan with predictable greed. "That sounds like a standard premium booking," I replied calmly. "Is there a problem with availability?" "No, ma'am, we have the staff for it. The issue is the payment method. When I asked for a card to hold the reservation, she handed me a silver corporate expense card. It bears your name and the Aurora Estates logo." Sarah paused, clearly uncomfortable reporting what looked like internal theft. "She claims she's your sister," she continued, dropping her voice. "She said you authorized her to use the corporate account for a family vacation. She's demanding we charge the whole package to that card." Chloe's audacity really was spectacular. She hadn't tried to skim a few $100s. She'd gone straight for the most expensive experiences the resort offered, entirely confident my supposed lowly status would shield her from any consequence. She believed the faceless corporation would simply absorb the cost while I took the reprimand. "What's the total cost of the requested services, Sarah?" I asked, pulling up the digital ledger on my screen. "The premium wellness package combined with the private helicopter charter comes to $4,200. She also requested a bottle of vintage champagne sent to her treatment room, which adds another $600. Nearly $5,000 in a single afternoon." Chloe was moving fast, eager to squeeze out maximum luxury before anyone caught on. "Did she sign the authorization slip?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "Yes, ma'am. I printed the standard form. She signed it right in front of me." "Did she sign her own name? Or mine?" A brief silence stretched over the line. "She signed Elmira Johnson." The final piece locked into place. Chloe hadn't just misused a corporate account. By forging my signature on a financial document to authorize nearly $5,000 in services, she'd crossed a serious legal threshold. Felony wire fraud, identity theft against a corporate entity. "Sarah," I said, letting my voice carry absolute authority, "process the transaction. Let the card go through. Give her the champagne, the massage, the helicopter tour. Give her the highest level of service we offer." "Are you sure, Ms. Johnson?" "The charges." "I'm entirely sure. Keep all the original signed receipts in a secure folder. Don't mention my actual position to her. Treat her exactly the way she expects to be treated." I ended the call and set the receiver back on the cradle. I turned my chair toward the expansive windows, watching the snow drift over the distant peaks. Chloe believed she was securing a life of luxury by exploiting my supposed weakness, bankrupting some mid-level manager to fund her own desires. In truth, she was cheerfully compiling a mountain of federal evidence, and I intended to let her enjoy every last second of it before the bill came due. The main lodge at Aurora Estates was built to evoke the grandeur of a 19th-century alpine retreat, reimagined with modern architectural polish. A towering riverstone fireplace anchored the great room, ringed by plush leather armchairs and a polished mahogany bar. I watched the space through the closed-circuit feed in my office. Chloe had finished her hot stone massage and glacial mud wrap. She emerged looking relaxed, draped in a designer silk blouse she must have packed specifically for an occasion like this. She settled onto a bar stool and waved a hand to summon the bartender, ordering a glass of vintage champagne without so much as glancing at the price. She never noticed the older gentleman sitting 2 stools away, nursing a neat bourbon. He wore a simple cashmere sweater and wire-rimmed glasses, looking for all the world like any other affluent retiree enjoying a quiet afternoon. He was not a tourist. His name was Arthur Pendleton. Arthur had made his fortune in commercial shipping out of Seattle before retiring to the last frontier, and he was also the primary financial backer of Aurora Estates. We'd met 6 years earlier, when I pitched the Ecolodge concept to a room full of skeptical venture capitalists. Arthur was the only one who saw the vision. He funded my initial construction phase and had stayed on as a silent partner ever since, preferring the shadows to the spotlight. We shared a mutual disdain for entitlement and a deep appreciation for calculated strategy. Chloe swiveled her stool, scanning the room for opportunity. She had a predatory instinct for wealth, honed over years of watching Brenda manipulate men for financial stability. She clocked Arthur's understated elegance, the Rolex on his wrist, the confident posture of a man who owned every room he walked into, and leaned toward him with a practiced, dazzling smile. I watched the silent exchange play out on screen and waited. 10 seconds later, my private cell phone buzzed. A text from Arthur appeared. A young woman just sat next to me. She's drinking the 2008 Dom Perignon and fishing for conversation. She bears a slight resemblance to you, Almira. Should I be concerned? I typed back quickly. That's Chloe, my half-sister. Engage her. She believes I'm a mid-level housekeeper who cleans the resort. See what she tells you. Arthur responded with a simple thumbs up. I adjusted the audio feed from the bar, tuning out the ambient jazz to isolate their voices. It's such a gorgeous property, Chloe said, crossing her legs and holding her champagne flute by the stem. I'm visiting from the lower 48. My husband and I needed a winter getaway. Alaska's beautiful, but the local labor really leaves something to be desired. Arthur took a slow sip of bourbon. Is that so? I've always found the staff here quite exceptional. Chloe let out a theatrical sigh, leaning closer. You only see the front of the house. I have insider knowledge. My older sister works here. Almira. She manages the housekeeping crew, or something equally mundane. She's a total disaster. We had to fly all the way up here just to check on her, because she lives in this freezing little shack down the road. It's honestly embarrassing. My mother's heartbroken over how far she's fallen. Arthur raised an eyebrow, the very picture of a sympathetic listener. That sounds like a heavy burden for your family. It's admirable of you to support her. We try, Chloe said, taking a generous gulp of the expensive champagne. But she's so ungrateful. We flew all this way and she threw us in a cabin with no heating and expected us to eat instant oatmeal. I told my husband I refused to suffer because of her poor life choices. So I decided to come up here and experience the real Alaska. A wise decision, Arthur noted smoothly. Though I imagine the amenities here cost a pretty penny. You must be doing quite well for yourself. Chloe's eyes gleamed. She loved the implication of wealth, loved the idea of impressing the sophisticated stranger. She leaned in even closer, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, entirely unaware that high-definition microphones were catching every syllable. Actually, I found a little loophole, Chloe bragged, tapping a manicured nail against the mahogany bar. Almira left a corporate expense card sitting on the table this morning. She's so careless. I brought it with me. I've been charging everything to the resort's corporate account. The massage, the helicopter tour, this champagne. The accounting department will just write it off as an operational expense. Almira takes the blame, but they can't make her pay it back if she's broke. It's the least she owes us for putting us through this miserable trip. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Arthur. She just confessed to corporate theft and wire fraud. Shall I call the sheriff? I smiled, watching the digital total climb on my secondary monitor. I typed back, "Not yet." Let her keep ordering the vintage Dom Perignon. The higher the bill, the tighter the knot. Arthur slid his phone back into his pocket and turned to Chloe with a charming grandfatherly smile. "That's quite a bold strategy, my dear. Aren't you worried they'll check the signatures?" Chloe laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed through the quiet bar. "I just sign Elmira's name. Nobody looks that closely. And even if they do, what are they going to do? Arrest a housekeeper over a few $1,000s? Corporate entities have insurance for this kind of thing. It's victimless." She genuinely believed her actions carried zero weight. She'd spent her whole life insulated from the consequences of her own greed. When she wrecked that leased car years ago, Brenda absorbed the financial blow. When she dropped out of college, Brenda covered the wasted tuition. Now she assumed a faceless corporation would swallow her luxury vacation while her estranged sister played the convenient scapegoat. I pulled up the central billing ledger and tracked the incoming charges in real time. The glacial mud wrap and hot stone massage totaled $800. The private helicopter charter added $3,400. The first glass of champagne ran $85. And now she was ordering a second round. The total had already surpassed $4,300. Under Alaska law, passing a forged document and obtaining services under false pretenses exceeding $1,000 constitutes a serious felony. Chloe wasn't dipping her toes into petty theft anymore. She was swimming in deep, prosecutable waters. I watched Arthur excuse himself from the bar, wishing Chloe a pleasant afternoon, and walk out of the camera frame, his role played flawlessly. Chloe stayed seated, basking in her perceived victory, signaling the bartender for another refill, drunk on champagne and on her own supposed brilliance. I compiled the digital receipts, the signed authorization forms forwarded by the concierge, and the audio recording of her bar conversation, and dropped them all into a secure encrypted folder on my desktop. The financial trap was closed. The legal snare at the cabin was set. The only task left was delivery. My office calendar chimed, reminding me of the evening's commitment. Tonight was the annual winter charity gala in the neighboring town. Aurora Estates served as the primary sponsor, funding local conservation efforts, and every prominent politician, investor, and business owner in the region would be in attendance. Brenda had eagerly agreed to attend, hoping to find some wealthy mark to bankroll her lifestyle, entirely unaware of my actual status. I stood up from my desk and smoothed the lines of my slacks. It was time to drive back to the freezing staff cabin and help my family get ready for the most important social event of their lives. They wanted to rub elbows with the Alaskan elite. I was going to give them a front row seat. The late afternoon sky deepened into a bruising purple as I guided the weathered utility vehicle back down the winding dirt path toward the boundary line. Tonight was the Winter Solstice Charity Gala, held annually in the neighboring township, an evening that gathered the region's most influential figures. State senators, venture capitalists, and local business moguls would all converge in a single room to raise funds for wilderness conservation. Aurora Estates underwrote the entire function. I'd paid for the catered salmon, the ice sculptures, the rental of the historic ballroom. My uninvited relatives knew none of that. They simply knew a high society party was happening, and they wanted in. I stepped onto the wooden porch and pushed the cabin door ajar. The electric space heater hummed its weak tune against the corner wall. Brenda blocked the narrow entryway, wearing an expression of hardened entitlement, arms crossed tight over her chest. She'd spent the last 48 hours festering in a space she deemed beneath her dignity. Chloe sat at the dining table filing her nails, radiating the smug satisfaction of a woman who'd just stolen thousands of dollars in luxury services. Trent was nowhere in sight, likely pacing the loft upstairs to escape the draft. Brenda didn't bother with a greeting. She launched straight into a calculated offensive. "You are a profound disappointment," Brenda said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the frozen timber. "I brought you into this world. I endured labor for you. And this is how you repay my sacrifice? You hide out in the woods working a dead-end job, forcing your own mother to sleep on a lumpy mattress." She stepped forward, invading my personal space, the heavy scent of her perfume filling the small room, masking the smell of the wood stove. "You were always a difficult child," she continued, eyes narrowing in accusation. "A heavy burden I had to carry. I did the best I could, but you never appreciated my efforts. Now I'm facing severe financial hardship, and you offer me generic bread and instant coffee. You owe me, Almira. I want the title to that Subaru. It's the least you can do to repay me for giving you life. I'll sell it when we get back to Seattle to cover my housing expenses." The word burden echoed through the cramped room, acting like a key that unlocked a vault of memories I usually kept sealed shut. I was 12 years old again. A brutal winter storm had trapped the boarding school under 3 feet of snow. I'd contracted double pneumonia, my lungs filling with fluid, breath reduced to a painful, shallow wheeze. The school nurse rushed me to the rural county hospital. I lay in a sterile white bed, burning with a dangerous fever, terrified I was going to die alone. The attending physician let me use the landline at the nurse's station. I dialed Brenda's Seattle number. It rang 5 times before she picked up. I choked out my location, begging her to come. I could hear a television blaring in the background. Brenda sighed into the receiver and told me she was busy preparing for a holiday party and couldn't be bothered with my dramatics. Then she hung up. The dial tone hummed against my ear, a continuous drone of rejection. I spent 5 days in that hospital ward learning to breathe on my own, listening to the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. The woman standing in front of me now held no power over me at all. The terrified 12-year-old had died in that hospital bed, replaced by a woman who now commanded an empire. I looked at Brenda. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend a single one of my choices. I gave her nothing but a cool, unblinking stare. The silence stretched, filling the room with an unbearable tension. Brenda shifted her weight, unnerved by my lack of reaction. She'd expected tears. She'd expected an apology, or at least a bitter argument. I gave her a void instead. A predator feeds on the struggle of its prey. When the prey simply stares back, the predator hesitates. "Are you planning to attend the charity gala tonight?" I asked, my tone perfectly even. The sudden shift in topic threw her off balance. Her eyes darted around the room, assessing my angle. "Of course we're going," Brenda replied, her greed instantly overriding the manufactured outrage. "It's a high society event. We belong there. Unlike you, we know how to conduct ourselves among successful people. There'll be wealthy investors in attendance, men who actually know how to provide for a woman." Chloe stopped filing her nails and looked up, a predatory gleam flashing across her face. "We're going to network," she added, smirking. "Maybe we'll find someone to fund our actual vacation. Someone who doesn't make us chop our own firewood." "I'm sure you'll make quite an impression," I said quietly. I turned and walked out the door, leaving the keys to the Subaru on the porch railing. Let them take the vehicle. It belonged to the corporate fleet. If they tried to sell it across state lines, they'd only be adding grand theft auto to their mounting list of transgressions. I drove a secondary utility truck back to my primary residence. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the Alaskan landscape into darkness. I stepped inside my heated home and began preparing for the evening. My preparation was an exercise in precision. I showered in a glass enclosure overlooking the pine forest, then selected a custom-tailored designer gown from my walk-in closet, a deep emerald silk, cut to project authority and elegance. I secured my hair in a sleek, polished style, and fastened a diamond necklace around my throat. The stones flawless, purchased with the profits of my third fiscal quarter. I looked in the mirror. I was the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar enterprise, ready to host my city. Miles away, in that freezing cabin, my relatives were undoubtedly scrambling to assemble some illusion of grandeur. The venue sat in the heart of the neighboring township. The grand ballroom featured a glaring eyesore among the polished luxury vehicles, its engine idling roughly, coughing dark exhaust into the crisp night air. Brenda, Chloe, and Trent emerged from the beat-up car. Their attire was a tragic display of outdated vanity. Brenda wore a sequined dress a decade out of fashion, paired with her stark white faux fur coat. Chloe had squeezed into a tight metallic cocktail dress entirely wrong for a formal winter gala, tottering on stilettos, visibly shaking against the freezing wind. Trent wore a shiny, ill-fitting suit straining at the buttons. They looked exactly like people desperately faking a status they'd never earned. A valet approached the Subaru, holding out a ticket. Trent shoved past the young man, waving him off, and tossed the keys onto the snowy pavement, expecting the staff to fetch them. Brenda marched up the sweeping stone staircase, head held high, scanning the entrance for wealthy targets. They pushed through the heavy glass doors and into the foyer as if they owned the building, arrogant, entitled, eager to conquer the room. They marched straight toward the grand ballroom, completely unaware they were stepping onto a stage I had built, walking blindly toward a public reckoning engineered entirely by their own greed. The historic ballroom glowed with a warmth that defied the freezing Alaskan night pressing against the tall, arched windows. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting fractured light across polished oak floors, illuminating the elite of the region. State senators, venture capitalists, and legacy business owners mingled near towering ice sculptures flanking the perimeter, while waitstaff in crisp, tailored vests circulated with silver trays of seared wild salmon, caviar, and vintage wine. It was a space defined by quiet power and understated wealth. I stood near the grand fireplace at the far end of the hall, in conversation with Arthur and the regional director of the Wildlife Conservation Board. My custom emerald gown draped perfectly to the floor, the diamond necklace catching the ambient light with every subtle movement. I kept my back angled toward the main entrance, using the reflection in a gilded mirror above the mantel to track the arriving guests. Through the silvered glass, I watched Brenda, Chloe, and Trent breach the foyer, moving with a desperate, frantic energy that instantly set them apart from the rest of the room. They bypassed the coat check, refusing to part with Brenda's stark white faux fur, perhaps believing it lent her sophistication. Instead, it marked her as an outsider. The trio gravitated straight to the open bar at the center of the room, recognizing free premium alcohol as an opportunity to indulge their unearned appetites. Trent leaned his elbows heavily on the polished mahogany counter, demanding top-shelf whiskey without so much as a greeting. Chloe ordered a complicated martini, inspecting her manicured nails while the staff scrambled to accommodate her. Brenda stood between them holding a glass of Chardonnay, eyes scanning the room with the practiced precision of a hawk hunting vulnerable prey. Evaluating watches, tailored suits, every subtle cue of wealth, eager to find a benefactor who could solve her impending financial ruin. From my vantage point, I watched Chloe's gaze sweep the ballroom and briefly land on my silhouette. I stayed turned away, sipping sparkling water. Chloe stared at the back of my emerald dress, her expression souring into visible envy. She admired the cut of the silk, the effortless posture of the woman wearing it, with zero idea she was coveting the very sister she'd spent the entire weekend degrading. She looked away quickly, hunting for a new audience for her fabricated narrative. She found her target near a display of the evening's charity items, Thomas Thorne, the town mayor, reviewing the silent auction pieces. Mayor Thorne was a distinguished statesman with silver hair and a quiet, commanding presence. He was also a close personal friend. We'd spent countless hours in my private office negotiating zoning permits and funding strategies for local conservation programs. He knew my history, my business, my face, intimately. Chloe approached him with martini in hand, offering a dazzling, rehearsed smile, positioning herself to intercept his attention, projecting the illusion of a wealthy, charitable socialite visiting from the lower 48. The ballroom's acoustics carried her shrill voice over the gentle hum of the string quartet in the corner. "It's truly a lovely event," Chloe projected, gesturing toward the ice sculptures. "We flew up from Seattle just for the occasion. Alaska is charming, but the local workforce certainly lacks refinement." Mayor Thorne turned toward her, his expression a mask of polite curiosity, holding a glass of mineral water as he assessed the young woman in the metallic cocktail dress. "We take great pride in our community," he replied, steady and measured. "What brings you to our township?" Chloe let out a theatrical sigh, swirling the olive in her glass, leaning closer, eager to spin her web for a man she'd correctly clocked as a local authority figure. "We're here on a family rescue mission," she explained, voice dripping with manufactured pity. "My older sister is a total deadbeat. Her name's Almyra. She manages the housekeeping crew at that big resort down the highway, lives in this freezing, pathetic little shack in the woods. My mother and I had to travel all this way just to check on her. It's honestly exhausting trying to support someone who refuses to apply herself." Mayor Thorne didn't blink. He didn't break eye contact. He simply stared at Chloe, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the lie she'd just confidently delivered. He knew the woman she was describing funded the very event they were standing in. He knew the woman she called a deadbeat housekeeper commanded a multi-million-dollar enterprise that sustained half the local economy. A look of profound confusion washed over his face, quickly followed by deep, settling pity. He was looking at a predator who'd wandered into a trap she couldn't begin to comprehend. "Is that so?" Mayor Thorne asked softly. "You must find it very challenging, carrying such a burden." "You have no idea," Chloe laughed, misreading his pity as admiration. "She couldn't even afford to heat the cabin she forced us to stay in, but we decided we wouldn't let her failures ruin our trip. We wanted to come tonight and mingle with the real contributors to this society." "I assure you," the mayor said, offering a tight, knowing smile, "the real contributors are watching everything very closely." He excused himself with a polite nod, walking away before Chloe could extract any further validation. She beamed, returning to Trent and Brenda at the bar, convinced she'd successfully charmed a prominent local figure. My attention shifted as the string quartet's gentle music faded into silence and the ballroom's low murmur hushed. The event organizer, a tall man in a tailored tuxedo, stepped up to the acrylic podium at the center of the grand stage and tapped the microphone. The sound resonated through the hall, signaling the start of the formal presentations. Brenda reacted to the shift instantly. She recognized the rhythm of a high society function. She knew speeches preceded the introduction of the primary donors. She set her empty wine glass on a passing tray and began shouldering her way through the crowd, pushing past business owners and philanthropic board members, ignoring their irritated glances. She wanted a front-row position. She was hunting for the mysterious owner of Aurora Estates, banking on a tragic sob story and a tearful plea to extract a generous handout from some wealthy billionaire. This was the exact tactic her entire history had been built on. Brenda never sought employment. She sought saviors. She'd discarded me at a boarding school because my existence complicated her pursuit of a man who promised to pay off her debts. Decades later, her survival strategy hadn't changed one bit. She stood at the edge of the stage, faux fur draped over her shoulders, eyes wide with greedy anticipation. The master of ceremonies cleared his throat, reading from a gilded card. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, thank you for joining us on this beautiful winter evening. He began, his voice projecting over the silent audience. Tonight, we gather to celebrate the preservation of our pristine wilderness. But this event, and the conservation programs it funds, would not be possible without the unparalleled generosity of our primary benefactor. Brenda leaned forward, holding her breath, adjusting her posture to intercept whoever walked down the center aisle. This individual didn't just build a premier destination, the organizer continued, gesturing toward the center of the room. She built a legacy of sustainability, resilience, and unyielding strength. She turned a single vision into an empire that supports our entire community. The main chandelier above the dance floor dimmed. A crisp, brilliant white spotlight ignited from the balcony overhead, swinging across the polished oak floor, cutting through the darkness. It swept past the bar, past the local politicians, and bypassed Brenda entirely. The beam settled firmly on the far end of the room, illuminating my emerald silk gown and the diamond necklace at my throat. I turned away from the gilded mirror and faced the crowd, head held high, stepping straight into the brilliant light. Please welcome our visionary CEO and founder of Aurora Estates, Almira Johnson. The announcer's voice echoed through the silent hall. The spotlight pinned me against the dark backdrop of the grand hall. The string quartet stopped playing. The ambient chatter of the region's most powerful figures evaporated into a breathless hush. I didn't look at the stage. I kept my gaze fixed on the reflection in the gilded mirror above the fireplace, watching the exact moment reality shattered the illusion my family had spent 2 days constructing. The color drained entirely from Brenda's face. Her jaw fell open, hanging in a silent, grotesque mask of shock. The smug confidence she'd carried all evening crumbled, replaced by the terrified realization that she'd walked blindly into a devastating snare. Beside her, Chloe lost all motor function. Her fingers went slack, and the expensive crystal martini glass slipped from her grip, striking the polished marble floor with a sharp, echoing crack, shattering into hundreds of glittering shards. Clear liquid splashed across the hem of her metallic dress and onto Trent's scuffed shoes. None of them moved to clean it up. They just stood frozen, staring at the woman they'd spent the last 48 hours mocking, belittling, and trying to exploit. I turned away from the mirror and walked slowly down the center aisle toward the podium. The crowd parted respectfully. State senators nodded in my direction. Local business owners offered warm smiles of recognition. I felt the weight of their gazes, but it wasn't a heavy burden. It was the solid, affirming presence of a community I'd earned through years of relentless discipline. I climbed the short staircase and stepped behind the microphone, looking out over a sea of upturned faces. In the third row, I saw Arthur raise his bourbon glass in a silent, approving toast. Near the back, standing beside the shattered glass, my biological relatives looked like cornered animals, eyes wide with disbelief. "Thank you," I began, my voice carrying clear and steady through the sound system. Alaska is an unforgiving frontier. It tests our endurance. It challenges our limits. But it also offers a profound truth. In this harsh environment, you cannot survive on empty promises. You cannot endure the winter by relying on the labor of others while contributing nothing yourself. I paused, letting the words settle over the silent room, my gaze drifting straight to the back of the hall. When I first arrived in this territory, I had nothing. I continued, keeping a calm, measured rhythm. I learned very quickly that true warmth is not handed to you. You have to build the shelter. You have to chop the wood. You have to lay the foundation with your own hands. I built Aurora Estates on the principle of self-reliance. We created a sanctuary not by extracting resources, but by cultivating them. We forged a community grounded in mutual respect, hard work, and accountability. I thought about the decade I spent sweeping the floors of that boarding school while Brenda lived comfortably in a heated Seattle townhouse. I thought about the rusted utility vehicle they'd complained about, the isolated cabin they'd deemed beneath their dignity. There are those who believe the world owes them comfort, I said, my tone sharpening into a precise edge. They see the success of others not as inspiration, but as an unfair distribution of wealth. They arrive with empty hands and demanding voices, expecting to harvest fields they never planted. But tonight, we celebrate the builders. We honor the people who understand that true legacy is earned, never demanded. The applause started before I'd even finished the final sentence, swelling into a thunderous ovation. Mayor Thorne stood, leading the room in a standing tribute. I offered a single graceful nod to the audience, stepped away from the podium, and walked down the side stairs toward the private VIP section. The VIP area was a secluded alcove near the tall, arched windows, cordoned off from the main floor by velvet ropes. I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and waited. It took less than 2 minutes for the storm to arrive. Brenda, Chloe, and Trent shoved their way through the still applauding crowd, ignoring the irritated protests of the regional elite. They ducked under the velvet rope, faces flushed with frantic, chaotic energy. A rational person facing such a profound miscalculation would feel shame. A normal family would retreat, humiliated by their own staggering ignorance. But my relatives had no capacity for self-reflection whatsoever. Instead of being humbled, their entitlement mutated into a fierce, blinding rage. They felt cheated, robbed of an opportunity they believed was their birthright. Brenda breached my personal space first, faux fur slipping off one shoulder, hands trembling. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline of raw greed. "You hid this from us," Brenda hissed, voice vibrating with genuine fury. "You let us sleep in that freezing shack. You let us eat instant food. You intentionally humiliated your own mother while you sat here wearing diamonds. Why did you hide your wealth from us?" She didn't ask how I'd achieved such success. She didn't express a single ounce of maternal pride. Her only concern was the delayed access to my financial resources. "I didn't hide anything," I replied softly, taking a sip of my water. "I simply matched the exact level of effort and care you provided me for the last 23 years. I gave you a roof. I gave you food. That's far more than you ever gave me." Brenda's eyes narrowed into dark, hateful slits. The mask of the concerned parent vanished entirely. "I gave you life," Brenda declared, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. "I brought you into this world. Everything you've built, every dollar in your bank account exists because of me. You owe me compensation for the years I sacrificed raising you. I'm entitled to half of this company. I'll hire a lawyer. I will take what belongs to me." The delusion was staggering. She genuinely believed her biological contribution entitled her to 50% of an empire she hadn't even known existed an hour earlier. Before I could respond, Chloe pushed past her mother. The spilled martini had stained the front of her dress, but she ignored it completely, her face twisted into an ugly sneer. When Chloe was 19, she'd demanded a brand-new luxury sedan from a dealership. When Brenda delivered a model with black interior instead of the requested beige, Chloe threw a horrific tantrum, claiming the mistake had caused her severe emotional distress and forced her mother to return the car and pay a premium restocking fee. Chloe operated under the firm belief that any deviation from her exact desires warranted heavy financial compensation. "You set us up," Chloe screamed, her voice shrill enough to draw the attention of the nearest guests. "You tricked us. You played a sick psychological game, pretending to be broke just to mock us. Do you know how traumatizing it was to stay in that cabin? You owe me $1 million for this deception. I'm not leaving this state until you wire the funds into my account." Trent stood behind them, shifting his weight nervously, scanning the opulent room, calculating the immense power differential. He'd finally realized they weren't bullying a lonely girl in a Seattle suburb anymore. They were threatening a corporate titan inside her own fortress. "Chloe, keep your voice down," Trent muttered, reaching for his wife's arm. "Don't tell me to calm down," Chloe snapped, yanking away from him. She stepped closer to me, fists clenched at her sides. "Write the check, Elmira, or I'll go to the press. I'll tell everyone in this room how you treat your own flesh and blood." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice to match her hysteria. I stayed devoid of emotion, absorbing their frantic demands without yielding a single inch of ground. I raised my right hand and offered a subtle, silent gesture toward the shadows near the alcove entrance. Two men stepped forward, wearing tailored dark suits and discreet earpieces, standing well over 6 feet tall, carrying the broad, unmovable presence of trained security professionals. They moved with silent efficiency, stepping between my family and me, forming a solid, impenetrable wall, hands crossed in front of them. Brenda gasped, stumbling backward. Chloe froze, her threats dying in her throat as one of the guards stared her down with blank, professional indifference. The physical boundary was established. The chaotic energy of their assault broke against the discipline of my defense. "You can't hide behind hired muscle," Brenda stammered, her false courage faltering. "We're your family. We demand an explanation." "You don't get to make demands on my property," I said calmly, stepping around the edge of the security detail so they could see my face. I reached into my designer evening clutch, bypassing the lipstick and the mirror, my fingers finding the cold, sleek aluminum frame of my digital tablet. I pulled it out, the screen illuminating my features in the dim light of the alcove. They wanted an explanation. They wanted to rewrite history and cast themselves as victims of some cruel deception. They were about to discover that I didn't deal in emotional arguments. I dealt in the brutal, inescapable weight of recorded facts. I unlocked the screen with my thumbprint and opened the encrypted folder on the desktop. The audio files, the financial ledgers, the signed legal contracts, all waited in perfect digital order. "You want to discuss what's owed?" I whispered, the cool glow of the screen reflecting in their panicked eyes. "Let's review the accounting." The sleek aluminum tablet felt cool against my palm, its screen casting a sharp, sterile light across the faces of the 3 people standing opposite my security detail. The surrounding guests in the VIP alcove had stopped their conversations entirely. State senators, regional executives, and philanthropic board members lingered near the velvet ropes, attention fixed on the drama unfolding in front of them. A silent audience for a performance my biological relatives had never intended to stage. I tapped the glass, opening the first digital folder. "You demand a share of this empire based on maternal devotion," I stated, my tone carrying a surgical detachment. "You claim a lifelong dedication that entitles you to financial reward. Let's examine the official record of that dedication." I turned the screen outward, displaying a digitized ledger bearing the official seal of the St. Elias Mountain Academy. "The institution where you left me maintained strict administrative protocols," I explained, projecting my voice just enough for the onlookers to catch it. "Due to its remote location, the administration logged every single piece of incoming mail, every phone call, every physical visitor, to ensure student safety. I pulled these archives directly from the State Educational Registry." Brenda stared at the illuminated spreadsheet, its columns sorted by year, tracking a full decade of my childhood. 10 years, I said, pointing to the blank spaces beside my name. 3,650 days, 0 visits, 0 phone calls, 0 letters. You didn't even send a signature authorizing my emergency medical treatment when my lungs failed. The objective truth of the ledger stripped away her lifelong narrative in an instant. Faced with undeniable proof, Brenda reached for her most practiced defense mechanism. She tried to solicit pity. Her lower lip quivered. She looked past me, aiming her performance at the affluent crowd lingering nearby. I was struggling, Brenda cried out, raising a trembling hand to her chest. I was a young mother facing profound financial hardship in Seattle. The flights were expensive. The roads were dangerous. I did the best I could under impossible circumstances. You cannot judge a mother for making difficult choices to survive. A few older guests near the perimeter shifted their weight, faces showing brief flashes of sympathetic discomfort. Brenda caught the hesitation and believed her tears were working, that she could manipulate the room by weaponizing her perceived vulnerability. I didn't let the illusion take root. I tapped the tablet a second time. The device paired instantly with the alcove's secondary Bluetooth sound system. A sharp burst of static crackled through the overhead speakers, followed immediately by the clear, unmistakable sound of a heavy chair scraping across rustic floorboards. Trent's voice echoed through the elegant space. We stay right here. She'll have to bring us food, water, and firewood just to keep us quiet. We live for free until the spring thaw, and there's nothing she can do to stop us. Trent's eyes went wide with sheer terror. He stepped backward, bumping into a marble pillar, the color draining from his cheeks, as he recognized his own calculated scheming playing out for an audience of powerful lawmakers and investors. The recording continued without pause. Chloe's shrill laughter filled the air. Almira's just a low-level employee. The headquarters accounting department will assume it's a legitimate operational expense. If they audit the books and find out the truth, they'll fire her, not us. She takes the fall, and we get the luxury vacation we deserve. Brenda's voice followed, murmuring soft agreement to the whole criminal conspiracy. I pressed the screen, cutting the audio. The atmosphere in the VIP alcove shifted instantly. The brief flicker of sympathy from the onlookers hardened into open disgust. A prominent real estate developer shook his head in silent reprimand. The wife of a local judge covered her mouth, her expression pure shock. The high society crowd understood, immediately and completely, the difference between a struggling parent and a coordinated group of parasites. Brenda's victim narrative disintegrated on the spot, replaced by the chilling reality of premeditated exploitation. You didn't come to Alaska seeking a family reunion, I said, my gaze sweeping over the three of them. You came to execute a hostile takeover. You plotted to claim adverse possession of my property and orchestrate my professional termination just to fund a holiday. Brenda opened her mouth, searching for a defense, but no words came. The recording had shattered her credibility completely. She looked to Trent for support, but her son-in-law was too busy staring at the floor, trying to shrink into the background. I turned my attention to the woman trembling in the stained metallic cocktail dress. Chloe clutched her small evening bag, breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Your ambition, however, surpassed mere trespassing, I noted, opening the next file on my device. I rotated the tablet toward Chloe. The screen displayed a high-resolution scan of the Aurora Estates Premium Wellness Authorization Slip. At the bottom of the page sat a rushed, looping signature reading Almira Johnson. Beside it, a digital tally of her afternoon indulgence. $4,385, I read aloud, treating the number with deliberate precision. You charged a glacial mud wrap, a hot stone massage, a private helicopter charter, and 2 bottles of vintage champagne to a corporate account you stole off my desk. Chloe swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. She raised her chin, attempting one last desperate bluff. It's a corporate write-off, Chloe said. Your boss has insurance for unauthorized charges. You're just a property manager. They can't hold you responsible for a family misunderstanding. That's the core of your miscalculation, I replied, my voice dropping into a cooler, sharper register. I'm not a mid-level manager. I gestured to the ballroom around us, the opulent fixtures, the attentive staff waiting near the perimeter. I own the desk you stole the card from. I own the lodge where you drank the champagne. I own the helicopter that flew you over the glaciers. You thought you were bankrupting a lowly housekeeper. Instead, you committed felony wire fraud and identity theft against a multi-million-dollar corporate entity. Chloe stumbled backward, her stilettos wobbling on the polished oak. Her mind struggled to process the magnitude of the legal line she'd just crossed. Under Alaska law, passing forged financial documents exceeding $1,000 triggers immediate, severe prosecutorial action. She hadn't stolen from a helpless sibling. She'd defrauded a registered enterprise. She's lying! Chloe shrieked, voice cracking under the pressure, eyes darting around the room, frantic for an ally. She gave me permission. We had a verbal agreement. Someone confirm it. A figure stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. Arthur Pendleton moved with the unhurried grace of a man who held undeniable authority, straightening his cashmere sweater, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he approached. The guests parted for him, recognizing the primary financial backer of the region's largest conservation fund. Chloe recognized him instantly, her face lit with sudden frantic hope. You! She pleaded, pointing a trembling finger. You were at the bar. You heard me say it was a corporate expense. Tell them she's exaggerating. Arthur stopped beside me, offering Chloe a polite, devastating smile. I remember our conversation vividly, he said, his tone carrying the seasoned weight of a corporate titan. I recall you bragging about stealing an expense card from a sister you deemed a disaster. I recall you explicitly stating your intention to let her take the fall for your unauthorized purchases. You detailed your entire fraudulent scheme over a glass of Dom Perignon. Chloe's hope shattered. Her breath hitched into a sharp gasp of pure panic. As the silent partner and primary investor of Aurora Estates, Arthur continued, eyes locking onto her with clinical detachment, I find your actions deeply concerning from a liability standpoint. Fortunately, I documented the entire interaction. The horror of true legal accountability finally landed. The trio realized they were standing in an enclosure built entirely from their own greed, surrounded by witnesses who wielded genuine structural power. Trent backed further away, putting physical distance between himself and his wife, implicitly abandoning her to face the consequences alone. Chloe buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking as the reality of a felony charge crushed her manufactured reality. Brenda watched her golden child collapse. She saw her son-in-law retreat. She looked at the elite crowd staring at her with unvarnished contempt. Her control over the situation had evaporated entirely. The narrative was lost. The financial rescue was dead. Driven by sheer frantic desperation to reclaim the upper hand, Brenda refused to accept defeat. If she couldn't manipulate the audience, she'd summon a higher authority. She plunged her hand into her white faux fur purse, fingers closing around the cold plastic of her phone, preparing one final catastrophic maneuver. When a seasoned manipulator realizes their audience sees straight through the facade, they don't apologize. They change the theater. They raise the stakes until the sheer audacity of the lie forces people to pay attention. Brenda intended to manufacture a public crisis, hoping the chaos would open an escape route. She pressed 3 digits and hit the external speaker. The rhythmic ringing of the emergency line echoed through the hushed VIP alcove. The surrounding politicians and business leaders watched in bewildered silence. County Emergency Dispatch, what is your location? A professional, disembodied voice cut through the tension. Brenda unleashed a masterclass in theatrical sorrow, forcing a raw, breathless sob into the microphone, clutching the phone to her chest. Please, you have to send officers to the Winter Charity Gala immediately, she cried, voice trembling with practiced vulnerability. My name is Brenda. I'm an elderly woman, and I'm being held against my will. My daughter, Almira Johnson, is committing elder financial abuse. She stole my entire life savings. She forced me into a freezing shack without heat or food. She stole my company from me. Please, she's hired thugs who are threatening my life right now. This maneuver was her signature survival tactic. Years earlier, whenever her reckless spending resulted in a legitimate eviction notice back in Washington state, she'd stand on her front lawn weeping to the passing neighbors, claiming her landlords were ruthless monsters targeting a vulnerable, destitute mother. She weaponized pity to extract loans from sympathetic strangers, dodging accountability by wearing the mask of a helpless victim. She assumed this elite Alaskan crowd would rush to protect a crying, fragile elder from a tyrannical corporate executive. Instead of rushing to her aid, the regional moguls simply stared. They knew the truth of my history. They knew I'd built Aurora Estates out of empty, frozen land while she was nowhere to be found. A tall figure detached himself from a group of state representatives near the arched windows. He wore a crisp, dark dress uniform with a gold star badge. Sheriff Holden served as the chief law enforcement officer for the municipality. We'd collaborated frequently on search and rescue protocols for the Wilderness Preserve, sharing a mutual respect for order and community safety. He understood the operational integrity of my enterprise better than anyone else in the room. Sheriff Holden walked toward Brenda with slow, measured steps, projecting an aura of unshakable authority. He didn't look concerned. He looked profoundly weary of the disruption. Brenda looked up, tears streaming down her cheeks, expecting a uniformed savior to arrest me on the spot. Instead, Holden reached out and gently plucked the glowing phone from her grasp, lifting it to his own mouth, bypassing her entirely. "Dispatch, this is Unit 1, Holden said, his low, rumbling baritone commanding instant obedience. "I'm on scene at the ballroom. Situation secure. Cancel the response. We're code 4. He ended the call and handed the silenced phone back to my stunned mother. "Ma'am," Sheriff Holden warned, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat, "filing a false police report is a serious offense in this jurisdiction. I'd suggest choosing your next words with extreme caution." Brenda sputtered, her fabricated tears drying instantly as she realized the performance had failed. "She stole my business. She's abusing me." I stepped forward, closing the distance between myself and the officer, ignoring her delusional accusations entirely. I presented the aluminum tablet, turning the screen toward him. "Sheriff Holden?" I said evenly, keeping a calm, professional demeanor. "I'd like to report felony wire fraud and an instance of corporate identity theft. The perpetrators are standing right here." Holden nodded, pulling a small notepad from his breast pocket. "Go ahead, Almira. Show me what you have." I scrolled to the high-resolution scans provided earlier by my concierge desk. "This afternoon, that young woman in the metallic dress presented a stolen corporate expense card at my wellness center," I explained, gesturing toward Chloe. "She forged my signature on this exact document to authorize over $4,000 in luxury services. The stolen card is currently sitting in her back pocket." I tapped the screen again, pulling up the audio file. "Furthermore, they trespassed on commercial property and conspired to claim illegal residency in order to extort my business," I continued. "I have their full confession recorded on audio, detailing their intent to ruin my professional standing and burden the company with their debts." Finally, I reached into my clutch and retrieved the folded, printed liability waiver, handing the physical paper to the officer. "To remove any confusion about their tenancy status," I concluded, "here's the binding contract they signed this morning. It clearly classifies them as transient short-term lodgers. They have zero squatter protections, and the contract subjects them to immediate expulsion for any fraudulent activity committed on the premises." Sheriff Holden reviewed the evidence with practiced clinical efficiency. Reading the forged signature on the digital scan, listening to the brief, damning playback of Chloe plotting the theft, examining the liability waiver, and noting the 3 distinct signatures at the bottom of the page. The chain of evidence was flawless, undeniable, legally binding. He shifted his focus from the screen to the trembling young woman. Chloe shrank back, her earlier bravado shattered into a million pieces. The spilled martini had left the floor slick, and she stumbled as the officer approached. "Miss," Holden said, extending an open palm, "hand over the silver expense card." Chloe reached behind her with shaking fingers, retrieving the Aurora Estates card and dropping it into his palm as though the plastic burned her skin. Holden inspected the embossed name, verifying my identity on the stolen property, then reached toward his utility belt. The sharp metallic clink of steel breaking free from a leather pouch sliced through the quiet alcove. A sobering, terrifying sound that marked the end of their game. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Holden instructed. It wasn't a request. It was an inevitable consequence. Chloe let out a piercing, hysterical shriek as the reality of a criminal charge broke through her lifelong shield of entitlement. "No!" she screamed, thrashing her shoulders, stepping away from the officer. "It's a mistake. She told me I could use it. Mom, do something. Tell him she's lying." Brenda stood paralyzed, mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. Her ultimate maneuver had backfired, transforming her from fake victim into a witness to her own daughter's arrest. Holden didn't tolerate the resistance. He expertly secured Chloe's left wrist, pulling her arm back with firm, professional force, and snapped the steel bracelet shut. The ratcheting sound echoed over the soft jazz that had resumed in the main hall. He secured her right wrist a moment later, locking her arms in place. "You are under arrest for felony wire fraud and identity theft," Holden recited, his voice steady over her continuous sobbing. Trent watched his wife being restrained by local law enforcement, and the severity of their legal jeopardy finally registered. A devoted husband might have stepped forward to defend her, or demanded to call an attorney. But Trent was a parasite who thrived on easy victories and manipulated loopholes. He recognized a losing battle, and his instinct for self-preservation overrode any marital loyalty. He said nothing. He offered no comfort. He took one step back, then another, retreating into the shadows of the velvet ropes, abandoning his bride, his face pale with sheer terror, eager to put distance between himself and the wreckage of their greed. He knew they'd played a game far outside their league, and he was ready to run. The wealthy guests watched the young woman weep, her expensive makeup running in dark streaks down her cheeks, staining her collar. She was no longer a glamorous socialite sipping vintage champagne and networking with billionaires. She was a criminal suspect, caught passing forged documents in a room full of the very people she'd tried to deceive. Brenda watched her golden child succumb to law enforcement. The grand rescue mission had disintegrated into a spectacular public disaster. The regional benefactors she'd hoped to court were staring at her with profound disgust. She'd exhausted her entire arsenal of manipulation. She couldn't intimidate me, couldn't outsmart my corporate legal team, couldn't leverage local authorities. Stripped of every usual tactic, she reached for the oldest theater in her repertoire. Brenda surrendered her remaining dignity. She collapsed, knees striking the marble floor with a heavy thud. The pristine white faux fur slipped from her shoulders, pooling around her waist like a discarded costume. She clasped her hands together, looking up at me through a veil of manufactured tears. "Please, Elmira," Brenda sobbed, her voice cracking under the weight of the performance. "I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I was terrified and confused by this entire situation. But we're blood. You can't do this to your own mother. You can't let them take your sister away to a jail cell. Family has to stick together. Family has to stick together." The phrase hung in the chilled air, a hollow platitude coming from a woman who'd fractured our bloodline 2 decades earlier. I looked down at her. I saw the cheap sequins on her outdated dress catching the chandelier light. I remembered standing in the gravel driveway of St. Elias Mountain Academy. I remembered the biting winter wind sinking into my 8-year-old bones as her taillights disappeared down the mountain road, leaving me among strangers. She hadn't stuck together with me when my lungs filled with fluid. She hadn't stuck together with me on graduation day, when I stared at an empty chair. "I asked you a single question on the phone last week," I said softly, my voice carrying an eerie, unshakable calm that forced the surrounding politicians and investors to lean in and listen. "I'll give you one final chance to answer it." Brenda stopped sobbing and looked up, breath hitching in her chest, a flicker of genuine terror crossing her features. "What was the name of my boarding school?" I asked. The ballroom fell into a profound, suffocating stillness. The catering staff stood motionless near the buffet tables. The bartender stopped polishing glasses. Everyone watched the weeping woman on the floor, waiting for her to redeem herself with a single piece of basic maternal knowledge. 10 seconds passed. Brenda opened her mouth, but her voice refused to produce a sound. Her eyes darted around the alcove, searching strangers' faces for a lifeline that didn't exist. 20 seconds elapsed. The silence became a physical weight pressing on her shoulders. She squeezed her eyes shut, digging frantically through the shallow archives of her memory, searching for a mascot, a town name, a teacher, anything to prove she'd cared. She found nothing. 30 seconds. Mayor Thorne shook his head, turning his gaze away from the pathetic display. He understood the gravity of her failure. A mother who loved her child would know the name of the institution where that child spent 3,600 days. 40 seconds. The agonizing passage of time stood as undeniable testament to her neglect. She had no idea where I'd spent a decade of my life. She'd never cared enough to memorize the name of my prison. The objective truth of her abandonment laid bare for the entire Alaskan elite to witness. "That's what I thought," I whispered, the words slicing through the quiet room with terminal finality. I stepped back, severing the emotional connection entirely, and turned my head toward the shadows at the back of the alcove. Marcus, my lead corporate attorney, stepped forward, wearing a sharp charcoal suit, carrying a pristine manila envelope, moving with the crisp, unyielding efficiency of a man delivering a finalized verdict. He stopped directly in front of Trent, extending his hand, pressing the thick envelope against Trent's chest until the coward was forced to take it. "What is this?" Trent stammered, holding the paper like it was toxic. "That's your formal notice of expulsion," Marcus explained, projecting his voice for the official record. "When you signed the guest liability and wildlife hazard waiver this morning, you legally acknowledged your status as a transient short-term lodger. Clause 4 explicitly states that any fraudulent activity conducted on Aurora Estates property terminates the lodging agreement forthwith. Since your wife just committed felony wire fraud, your invitation is permanently revoked." Brenda scrambled to her feet, face pale, hands trembling as she smoothed her sequined dress. "You can't evict us into the snow. It's freezing outside. We have tenant rights. We established residency." Marcus offered a thin, professional smile. "You surrendered your residential rights when you signed the commercial waiver. You're now classified as trespassers. You have exactly 1 hour to vacate the staff cabin. My security team has already packed your belongings. Your suitcases are currently sitting on the curb outside the main resort gate. If you remain on the premises past that deadline, you'll incur a $500 penalty for every hour you overstay, and my client will authorize Sheriff Holden to arrest you for criminal trespassing." The legal checkmate was absolute. They held no leverage, no finances, no shelter. They'd traded their only advantage for the illusion of power, signing away their future without reading the fine print. Sheriff Holden tugged gently on the steel chain connecting Chloe's wrists, guiding the weeping woman toward the main exit. The crowd parted, creating a wide path for the officer and his prisoner. Chloe kept her head down, her metallic dress shimmering under the exit signs as she walked out into the freezing Alaskan night. I raised my hand, signaling my private security detail. The two towering guards stepped forward, placing their hands firmly on the shoulders of Brenda and Trent, guiding my remaining relatives away from the VIP section, marching them across the polished oak floorboards. Brenda tried to look back at me, eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief, but the guards kept her moving toward the coat check. I watched the heavy glass door swing shut behind them. They were gone. The threat to my sanctuary was neutralized. I turned back to the remaining guests, offering a polite smile, ready to resume the gala and celebrate the success of my enterprise. But a predator backed into a corner rarely accepts defeat quietly. The immediate physical confrontation was over, but Brenda still had a smartphone, a desperate need for vindication, and access to an entire network of extended relatives in Seattle who thrived on manufactured drama. As the string quartet resumed a lively symphony, my personal cell phone buzzed deep inside my clutch, signaling the start of a relentless digital siege. The morning light over the Chugach Mountains was brilliant and clear, in sharp contrast to the digital storm raging on my bedside table. I woke to the rhythmic vibration of my phone rattling against the mahogany nightstand. I picked it up and looked at the screen. 79 missed calls, 42 unread texts, 14 voicemails. The notifications formed a solid, uninterrupted block of frantic, escalating panic. Brenda hadn't wasted any time. Stripped of her local audience and escorted off my property, she'd turned to the only theater she had left to control. She'd activated the extended family network back in Seattle, spending the early morning hours spinning a hysterical, fabricated narrative to my aunts, uncles, and cousins. In her version of events, I was a tyrannical, wealth-obsessed monster who'd lured my vulnerable family to Alaska, trapped them in a freezing cabin, framed my innocent sister for a crime she didn't commit, and thrown my elderly mother out into the snow. I didn't answer a single call. I carried the phone into my kitchen, poured a cup of dark roast coffee, and sat at the granite island. I opened the messaging app. The texts followed a predictable, escalating pattern of manufactured outrage. Aunt Susan demanded to know how I could abandon my flesh and blood in a strange state. Cousin Mark sent a lengthy paragraph calling me a disgrace corrupted by corporate greed. Another aunt left a tearful voicemail begging me to drop the charges against Chloe, insisting that family disagreements should never involve law enforcement and jail cells. They were acting as flying monkeys, dispatched by a narcissist to harass the target into submission, operating on incomplete information, driven by a misplaced sense of tribal loyalty and Brenda's weaponized tears. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel the familiar childhood urge to defend myself, call them back, or set the record straight. Explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you is a profound waste of energy. Instead, I used a tactic straight out of corporate risk management. I documented everything. High-resolution screenshots of every accusatory text, timestamps on every missed call, transcriptions of every voicemail. I organized the digital evidence into a secure, encrypted folder on my cloud server. Then I flipped the phone to silent and set it face down on the granite. I embraced the profound, untouchable peace of going quiet. The silence in my kitchen wasn't lonely. It was liberated. I walked into my study and stood at the expansive glass windows overlooking the primary access road of Aurora Estates. The private snowplows had already cleared the asphalt, leaving high white banks along the tree line. A yellow local taxi navigated the winding curve toward the main resort exit. Through the glass, I watched it slow near the security gate. My security feed confirmed the passengers, Brenda and Trent, in the back seat. Faces pale, posture defeated and tense. They were fleeing the battlefield. Chloe was currently sitting in a holding cell at the Municipal County Jail, awaiting formal arraignment for felony wire fraud, facing serious federal implications. A devoted mother and a loyal husband might have stayed, hired a local defense attorney, secured a hotel room in town, fought for her release. But Brenda and Trent were opportunists, and opportunists don't stick around when the ship starts taking on water. They had to secure their own escape. I knew the local airline tariffs well. Last-minute, same-day departures from Anchorage to Seattle cost a premium. With the stolen expense card deactivated and their eviction from the property complete, they'd been forced to empty their own pockets, maxing out personal credit just to retreat from a territory they'd arrogantly chosen to invade. I watched the taxi pass through the iron gates, merge onto the public highway, and disappear into the tree line. The physical threat was officially gone. Still, one lingering detail remained unresolved in my mind, the catalyst that had set this entire ordeal in motion. That first phone call. Brenda had called me weeping, claiming her new husband, Frank, had abandoned her, emptied their bank accounts, and left her facing a 3-day eviction notice. She'd demanded exactly $3,000 to prevent imminent homelessness. The math had never lined up. People facing sudden eviction don't orchestrate elaborate Alaskan vacations. I decided to pull the last thread of her deception and see what unraveled. I sat at my desk and opened my secure laptop. Aurora Estates retained a premier corporate investigator on retainer. We used his services for deep background checks on high-level vendors and potential executive hires. His name was David, and he had a talent for uncovering public financial records with surgical speed. I sent him a brief, encrypted email with Brenda's current Seattle address and Frank's legal name, asking him to verify their residential tenancy status and check for any recent civil filings, bankruptcy claims, or eviction notices in their county court system. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing architectural blueprints for a new wellness pavilion, letting the inquiry run its course, a quiet certainty settling into my chest. When dealing with lifelong manipulators, the most dramatic tragedies are usually a smokescreen for mundane greed. At noon, a secure notification popped onto my screen. David had returned the report. The findings were stark, clear, and highly illuminating. There was no eviction notice filed at the county courthouse. The property management company handling Brenda's townhouse confirmed her rent was paid in full for the next 2 months. A quick scan of local traffic cameras and utility registrations confirmed Frank hadn't left at all. His vehicle sat parked in their assigned driveway, and he was currently renewing his local business license. The tragic tale of the abandoned, destitute wife was a total fabrication. But David had dug deeper into her financial footprint, accessing a peripheral sweep of recent credit inquiries linked to Brenda's primary email. He flagged a pending transaction that had stalled due to insufficient funds, an invoice from a premier maritime travel agency for a 14-day luxury Caribbean cruise scheduled to depart from Miami in early March. The itinerary featured a premium balcony suite, unlimited top-shelf beverage packages, and private VIP shore excursions in St. Bart's. I scrolled to the bottom of the invoice. The required deposit to secure the reservation, exactly $3,000. I leaned back in my chair, letting the revelation settle. She hadn't called me in a moment of desperate panic. She'd called me because she wanted to fund a tropical vacation, and she viewed my bank account as her personal travel budget. When I refused to play the obedient, terrified daughter, she pivoted, scammed my grandmother for the airline tickets, brought Chloe along to exploit my perceived weakness, and tried to hijack my entire life to bankroll her leisure. Every tear, every plea, every accusation had been a calculated piece of a long con designed to extract luxury at my expense. It was time to dismantle her theater for good. I opened my personal email client, created a new message, and populated the recipient field with every extended family member who'd texted or called me that morning. Aunts, uncles, cousins, distant relatives. I gathered the entire digital audience she'd weaponized against me into a single, unblinking thread. I left the subject line blank and typed a single sentence in the body. Here is the truth you are looking for. I attached 3 files. First, the audio recording from the hidden USB drive, clearly documenting Brenda, Chloe, and Trent plotting to claim squatter rights and steal corporate funds. Second, the public booking record from the municipal county jail detailing Chloe's felony charges, complete with her booking photo and the arresting officer's official statement. Third, the intercepted travel agency invoice showing the $3,000 Caribbean cruise deposit under Brenda's name, exposing the foundational lie behind her entire scheme. I didn't add a lengthy explanation. I didn't ask for their understanding or demand an apology. The evidence spoke with a brutal, undeniable clarity that no amount of emotional manipulation could refute. I reviewed the recipient list one final time and hit send. The email vanished into cyberspace, carrying the payload that would shatter Brenda's carefully constructed victim narrative across her entire social network. She would return to Seattle not as a tragic martyr, but as an exposed fraud, forced to explain undeniable proof of her predatory behavior to everyone she knew. I closed the laptop. The digital siege was broken. The flying monkeys were silenced for good. I walked back to the expansive glass windows of my study, looking out over the pristine, snow-covered Alaskan landscape. The sun shone brightly against the mountain peaks, reflecting a brilliant, unyielding light. My territory was secure. The storm had passed, leaving nothing behind but clear skies and the quiet, solid truth of the empire I'd built. The fire crackled in the Riverstone hearth, casting a warm, golden glow across the vaulted timber ceiling of my living room. Outside, the Alaskan winter raged on, burying the pine forest under fresh, heavy snow. The wind howled against the reinforced glass, but the cold couldn't reach past the walls I'd built. Inside, the air smelled of cedarwood, roasted wild salmon, and genuine comfort. I sat in my favorite leather armchair, holding a mug of spiced tea, watching the people gathered around my coffee table. Arthur sat near the fire, recounting a story from his early shipping days, a glass of neat bourbon in his hand. Sarah, my lead concierge, laughed at his punchline, sharing a plate of food with her husband. Mayor Thorne and off-duty Sheriff Holden stood by the kitchen island, debating local zoning regulations with easy, familiar camaraderie. These weren't my employees or business associates. They were my chosen tribe, the people who recognized my worth, supported my vision, and stood beside me when the shadows grew long. I looked at them and felt a profound sense of clarity. For 23 years, I'd carried an invisible weight, dragging the heavy expectation of biological loyalty across every milestone of my life. I'd harbored a quiet, desperate hope that one day my mother would look at me with pride. I'd waited for a sisterly bond that only ever existed in fiction. I'd poured my emotional energy into a bottomless well, hoping to draw water from dry earth. Sitting by the fire, I finally understood the fundamental truth about kinship. Sharing DNA is merely an accident of biology. It doesn't generate automatic loyalty, and it certainly doesn't grant anyone a free pass to exploit your hard work. Family isn't defined by birth certificates or shared last names. Family is defined by consistent action. Family is the group of people who show up when the storm hits, who respect your sanctuary, and who celebrate your victories without demanding a cut of the profits. My biological relatives had proven they were incapable of any of that. Their absence from my life was no longer a tragic loss. It was a vital layer of protection. Once I stopped grieving the family I wished I'd had, I found the freedom to embrace the family I'd actually earned. Actions carry inescapable consequences. The universe has a precise way of balancing the scales once you stop intervening to protect predators from their own choices. News from the lower 48 trickled back to me through reliable channels over the following months, charting the collapse of the fraudulent empire my mother had tried to sustain. Chloe remained in the municipal county jail for 3 grueling days, without Brenda there to instantly post bail or hire a premium defense attorney. She got a hard, unfiltered look at the justice system. A public defender eventually arranged her release, but her ordeal was far from over. She's currently navigating the federal courts, facing multiple counts of wire fraud and identity theft. The legal fees are draining every cent she has. The pristine, consequence-free bubble Brenda spent decades inflating has burst for good. Chloe will carry a felony record for the rest of her life, a heavy anchor on her professional and social reputation. Trent behaved exactly as a coward does when the illusions shatter. He didn't stay in Alaska to support his wife through her arraignment. He booked the first available flight back to Washington state, prioritizing his own escape over his marriage vows. His instinct to flee bought him no permanent sanctuary. Word reached me that he lost his remote sales job over erratic behavior and unexcused absences. Without Chloe's mother around to subsidize their lifestyle, he fell far behind on his financial obligations and now faces formal eviction proceedings from his own Seattle apartment. The tragic fate they'd gleefully plotted for me had become their own inescapable reality. Brenda suffered the most poetic, devastating downfall of all. The local Alaskan prosecutor didn't treat her theatrical emergency call as a harmless mistake. They formally charged her with filing a false police report, forcing her to pay hefty municipal fines. But her true punishment happened within her own social circle. The email I'd sent, with the cruise invoice, the audio recordings, and Chloe's arrest records, hit like a localized earthquake. Narcissists need a compliant audience to survive, and my email tore the curtain down on her whole stage. The extended relatives who'd bombarded my phone with outraged messages went silent. Confronted with undeniable, time-stamped proof of her predation, her flying monkeys scattered. Her siblings refused to loan her money for legal fees. The travel agency canceled the luxury Caribbean cruise over a frozen bank account, keeping the non-refundable deposit. Brenda now sits in a quiet, lonely townhouse, entirely isolated by her own deception, with no victims left to drain and no audience left to manipulate. Meanwhile, the ecosystem I cultivated continues to thrive. The winter season closed with record-breaking profit margins for Aurora Estates. We recently broke ground on the new wellness pavilion, expanding our footprint while holding to our commitment to environmental preservation. My staff received generous quarterly bonuses, and the local conservation fund hit its annual goal 3 months early. My empire flourishes because it's rooted in tangible reality, built on integrity and mutual respect, rather than coercion and deceit. The contrast between our lives isn't a matter of luck. It's the direct result of the choices we made. They chose to extract. I chose to build. They relied on deception. I relied on discipline. I want to speak directly to you now. If you're listening to my story, you might recognize the heavy, suffocating weight of toxic obligation. You might have a parent who demands your time, your money, and your emotional labor while offering nothing but criticism in return. You might have siblings who see your success as a resource they're entitled to consume. You might lie awake at night, carrying an overwhelming, crushing guilt for simply wanting peace. Society conditions us to forgive endlessly. We're taught to endure disrespect in the name of familial duty, to keep the peace, to turn the other cheek, to accept mistreatment because blood is supposedly thicker than water. Let me offer a fundamental truth I learned in the frozen north. Setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It's an act of survival. You are not required to endure abuse to prove your loyalty. You are not obligated to finance the poor decisions of adults who refuse to take accountability for their own lives. You do not owe your abusers a seat at the table you built from scratch. True empowerment comes from recognizing your own inherent worth and refusing to let predators discount it. You have to protect your sanctuary. You have to remember that you are never required to set yourself on fire just to keep someone else warm. I face the ghosts of my past and refuse to let them haunt my future. I held my ground, spoke the truth, and watched the illusions crumble. The peace I feel tonight, looking at the fire and listening to the laughter of my true friends, is worth every difficult decision it took to get here. Have you ever had to enforce an unbreakable boundary with a toxic parent or a manipulative relative? Did you face the guilt, hold your ground, and walk away to protect your own peace? How did it change your life once the storm passed? Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and I know your courage will inspire someone else fighting that exact same battle right now. Thank you for listening to my journey. Protect your space, build your empire, and never apologize for choosing yourself. There is a haunting, lingering resonance in the image of an empty chair. In American culture, where high school graduations are celebrated as profound rites of passage, filled with cheering families, flashing cameras, and bouquets of flowers, an empty seat in the audience is never just a physical void. It's a profound emotional betrayal. Almira Johnson's story serves as a moral mirror for modern society, illustrating the devastating consequences of toxic parenting alongside the transformative power of self-cultivation. It's a narrative that forces us to look closely at the foundations of our own homes, asking us to weigh the true meaning of family responsibility, the heavy burden of traditional roles, and the long-term guidance we owe the next generation. At the very heart of this reflection sits a broader social reality, the poison of entitlement. In many contemporary circles, a growing crisis of materialistic entitlement is eroding the foundational bond between parent and child. Within a healthy family structure, a parent's fundamental duty is to provide not just shelter, but a moral compass, a steady hand guiding a child through the turbulent waters of life. Brenda embodies a kind of spiritual bankruptcy, treating a child as a disposable burden when inconvenient, and as an ATM when money is needed. That disposable approach, abandoning a child for 10 years with 0 visits or phone calls, is a grave violation of moral duty. It shatters the sacred covenant of parenthood. This dynamic also exposes the dark underbelly of golden child syndrome, visible in Chloe. Shielding a child from accountability creates an entitled adult who turns to criminality and fraud the moment reality closes in. When parents confuse love with an absence of boundaries, they don't protect their children. They ruin them. They raise adults who believe the world owes them endless comfort. Parents need to understand that raising a child without a moral compass or a sense of work ethic sets that child on a path toward inevitable self-destruction. True fairness in parenting means letting children face the consequences of their own actions, teaching them that worth is forged in character, not handed down through a mother's endless excuses. Navigating fractured family dynamics like these requires real emotional awareness and discernment, the wisdom to see through the illusions of manipulation. In American culture, there's a heavy expectation to blindly honor one's parents, an expectation toxic family members routinely weaponize to extract unearned loyalty. Brenda tried exactly that, using family values to guilt Almira into funding a luxury cruise under the guise of an eviction crisis. But wisdom lets a person tell the difference between a genuine need and a deceptive trap. Almira's icy, calculated response wasn't cruelty, it was discernment. She used logic, legal frameworks, and undeniable, time-stamped proof to protect her peace. For parents and children alike, that same wisdom means understanding that real family is built on presence and support, not just biology. It takes the emotional intelligence to recognize that you can't heal a wound by continually handing the knife back to the person who cut you. This brings us to the value of integrity over deceit. The stark contrast between Almira's self-made success and her family's parasitism underlines just how much morality matters. While Brenda and Chloe committed felony wire fraud and identity theft to fund a lifestyle they hadn't earned, Almira built an empire through scholarships and sheer grit. Her story is a quiet, unyielding testament to the American dream pursued with honest hands. Integrity, in the end, is the ultimate protection. Almira's ability to stay calm while her family screamed for unearned wealth reflects the strength that comes from a clean conscience. We owe the next generation the lesson that wealth without character is a cage, leading only to public shame and legal ruin. Honesty isn't just a moral ideal, it's the strongest armor a person can wear in a world that often rewards deception. In the face of abandonment, resilience matters too. Left at a boarding school at age 8, graduating to an empty chair, Almira didn't let bitterness consume her. Instead, she used her solitude to build Aurora Estates, in a sense, practicing a kind of internal alchemy, turning the lead of abandonment into the gold of self-reliance. Resilience is the unbreakable boundary that lets a person say no to toxic influence without setting themselves on fire to keep someone else warm. It's the realization that walking away from toxicity isn't a failure of love, it's a triumph of self-respect. Ultimately, the universe has an elegant, if ruthless, mechanism for balance. This story reinforces the timeless truth that actions carry inevitable results. Brenda's attempt to weaponize a 911 call for a false report became the very catalyst for her own downfall. The 40 seconds of silence during their final confrontation echoed, almost poetically, the decade of silence she'd imposed on her own daughter. It stands as a chilling warning to parents everywhere. The seeds of neglect and manipulation planted today eventually bear the fruit of alienation and accountability. You cannot sow deceit and expect to harvest devotion. Building a good life means moving past the superficial and focusing on self-correction. True empowerment doesn't come from exploiting others or demanding respect you haven't earned. It comes from building a community of choice, honoring your responsibilities, and raising children with the wisdom to be independent and the morality to be kind. Setting boundaries isn't an act of hate. It's an act of survival and self-respect that lets a person live in genuine, unbothered peace. If this story of resilience, boundaries, and the quiet triumph of truth resonated with the echoes of your own life, I invite you to subscribe to Luck Revenge Start, where we continue exploring the intricate, often painful, but ultimately empowering journeys of people reclaiming their peace from the ashes of betrayal. As you step away from this story, look closely at the invisible threads connecting your own family. Are they woven with mutual respect, honest guidance, and unconditional support? Or are they held together by obligation, silent resentment, and debts that can never truly be repaid? We like to believe blood binds us in a way time and distance can never break. But maybe, in the quiet hours of the night, when the noise of the world fades, we have to ask ourselves a harder question. If every title of mother, father, or sister were stripped away, would the people in your life still be standing beside your chair? Or would you find yourself looking out at an empty room? The answer to that question isn't just a reflection of them. It's a mirror held up to the very life you've chosen to accept.